The law, as written by Congress, the implementation legislation of the Fed, says that the president can fire a Federal Reserve Board governor with cause.
In this episode, Jeffrey Tucker unpacks the recent controversy surrounding the Federal Reserve. He's the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute and senior economics columnist at the Epoch Times.
No president since 1913 has taken on the Fed the way Trump is taking it on now. And the Supreme Court, I think, is going to have to decide.
How did the creation of the Federal Reserve change America? Does President Trump have the authority to fire a Federal Reserve governor for alleged mortgage fraud? And what does it really mean to be an independent federal agency?
What's striking to me about this, for all these years, this question has never really been asked at this level, much less answered.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Jeffrey Tucker, so good to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Jan.
Let's start with this recent firing of the Federal Reserve Governor, Lisa Cook. Mm-hmm. Is this something that can happen? This is something that's wildly contentious it's seemingly in our society, and people are coming in on either side. What's your take?
Well, she refuses to resign, believing that it can't happen, that she's untouchable in some sense. The president cannot do this. The problem is that the law, as written by Congress, the implementation legislation of the Fed, says that the president can fire a Federal Reserve Board governor with cause. Right? That's what it says, which implies that the president is in charge. The president is what keeps the Fed accountable. Now, Trump believes this, and so he found somebody on the board that he can fire with cause. Now, the allegation, I have to say allegation because that's the way we talk, but actually it's true. She named two separate primary residences in her mortgage applications. You can't have two primary residences. The advantage for doing that is that you get favorable interest rates because on your primary residence there's less risk, so you get a more favorable loan rate. So she got two favorable loan rates. And then you've got really interesting problems concerning the deductibility of interest. You can only deduct the interest that you pay on a loan from your primary residence. If you buy the second, third, and fourth house, that's on you. So actually, this is a federal crime to do this. And maybe it's common. Maybe it goes on all the time. We don't really know. Maybe there's a certain class of borrowers who just do this routinely. Lisa Cook treats it like it's no big deal, like a parking ticket or something like that. But it's actually a federal crime. So if you're looking for some reason to go after a Fed board governor with cause, this is a good cause. So I think Trump will prevail in this particular case, but it will have to be decided most likely by the Supreme Court. What's important here, Jan, is there's a lot more at stake than just this one regulation about residences and mortgages. It has to do with whether and to what extent the Fed is actually accountable to the President of the United States. That's what's at issue. What's striking to me about this is that the Fed has been around since 1913. This question has never really been asked at this level, much less answered. For all these years, this country, we've pretended as if there's such a thing as an independent central bank, and everybody knows what that is. Well, there's another word for independence. That is unaccountable, right? I mean, independent sounds great. Unaccountable sounds bad. Well, the Fed's unaccountable. They've not been held to account for any outside audits in its entire history. Any political intervention is widely seen by financial markets as something like a catastrophe. You're risking the nation's financial stability, and so on and so on. But in the end, we are governed by this document called the Constitution. And we're a nation of laws. And the Constitution has three buckets It has a judiciary, it has a legislative branch, and an executive branch. In the org chart of the federal government, printed by the federal government, that everybody agrees is true, the Federal Reserve is under the executive branch and reports to the president. You can see it. The org chart is very clear about that. You can say it's independent. Well, is that just sort of a norm that we just have a hands-off policy?
Well, this is what I was going to ask, because, you know, certainly in the judiciary, precedent is hugely important. It impacts a great many things. Is that the case here? Because clearly, as you've outlined, the precedent has been, you know, independence.
So we don't really know in a constitutional sense what that means. And you'd think that we would know, but we don't actually know what it means for there to be an independent agency under executive department. So what's exciting about the times in which we live is that we're finally getting answers to these questions. The Supreme Court's been very clear up to now that the president is in charge of the agencies, executive agencies. So let's just say the Department of Labor or USAID or Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, or HHS. They can, in fact, fire employees. Now, 5 years ago, we didn't know the answer to this question, right? I mean, I think we've had these discussions for a while. We didn't actually know whether the president was really in charge of executive agencies. The Supreme Court, in a series of cases, has been very clear the president is in charge of executive agencies, but we know Trump. That's great, but now Trump is taking on the great question of American life, which is the status of the Federal Reserve under the law. That is an unanswered question. So this is a taboo topic. We've never been here before. No president since 1913 has taken on the Fed the way Trump is taking it on now. And the Supreme Court, I think, is going to have to decide that this is an executive agency.
Jeffrey, just one quick sec. We're going to take a break, and folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with founder of the Brownstone Institute and senior economics columnist at the Epoch Times, Jeffrey Tucker. Maybe, give me a little background here. Why, for those that are uninitiated, why would the president feel right now that he needs to take on the Fed?
Well, President Trump's annoyed at the Fed because he thinks that they're keeping interest rates too high. Now, you can agree or disagree with that. I happen not really to agree with that, but I do agree that you need some accountability for the central bank. I mean, you can't just have this floating financial institution, arguably the most important institution in the United States, the most impactful institution in the United States.
And by extension, the
world. Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Yeah.
The globe, because we're on a world dollar standard. So the Federal Reserve is the most powerful institution, arguably in the world. And it's just this free-floating agent out there that nobody knows to whom it reports, if it reports to anybody. But under the Constitution, the founding fathers were not idiots. They knew, the monetary issue was an important issue for any country. But they addressed a lot of things in specifics in the Constitution. They addressed copyrights and patents. They addressed even like the post office. They address all sorts of specific issues. But trade, for example, is in there. But one of the issues they address in Article 1, Section 8 is the money power. Mm-hmm. And they specifically grant to Congress the job of coining currency, to managing currency and coining money. All right, so that belonged to Congress. Well, very quickly after, and that's for a reason, because they understood the monetary power is quite frequently abused by the executive, kings, coin clipping. There's hundreds and thousands of years of abuse of the monetary financial system by big shot executives, whether it's pharaohs or kings or princes or whatever. So they wanted it to belong to the Congress, which is to say the people. That was a specific decision made for a specific reason. It's very wise. And they also even restricted the states from making anything other than gold and silver as money, because they wanted to mitigate against the problems of inflation, depreciating currency, because they knew this had led to upheavals in the past. You can read the Founding Fathers on money. They had a lot of views on this topic. Thomas Paine's most famous for having written Common Sense and railing against the ermine robes of King George or whatever, but actually he has a lot of writing on the monetary question too. He hated paper money. He said paper money was the source of great evil that leads to inflation and business cycles, trade cycles of booms and busts. He had very sophisticated economic understanding. And I'm not saying that Tom Paine was some sort of unique figure. This whole generation understood that bad money can ruin a country and a society and send the entire culture into upheaval. So they wanted sound money and they wanted hard money. They wanted the money to belong to the people, guarded by the people for the people. That's why they had, in Article 1, Section 8, they granted to Congress the power to coin money and restricted even the states. Now, we had a 10th Amendment, so states have a lot of rights, but they did not have the right to create paper money. That's in the Constitution. So that's how serious they were about this topic. Now, soon after the founding, there was an effort to create a national bank, and it didn't last long. So then we had a long period of what's called free banking. It lasted for many years, and there were changes in the kind of regime, that the relationship of the Treasury to the money, what we're going to have money, we're going to have a gold standard, a silver standard, bimetallism. There are all sorts of acts coming out from Congress regulating this stuff. But during the 1870s and the 1880s and 1890s, we had growing outrage against what was called wildcat banking. So we had the railroads going through the country, and everywhere the railroads went, property values would rise and business would start popping up. And of course, banks popped up at that area too. And they started lending money to everybody, and that if the railroad failed or didn't actually show up at all, the banks would go belly up and take everybody's deposits, and people get angry, right? So that was called wildcat banking. Lots of booms and busts. Banks were regarded as normal institutions, like grocery stores or newspapers or just another market institution. They could fail, they could succeed, but it was determined by the markets. Now that's a little fraught for from the depositor's point of view. You can't know for sure. You got to pick well. Yeah, you got to pick well. But there was competition between banks, and bad bankers went out of business. Good bankers thrived. I mean, it's a kind of a decent system overall, but maybe not incredibly popular for people who's lost their deposits, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of pressure during this period to stabilize the institution.
Something that just strikes me, Jeffrey, I can't help but think that in a society that's very focused on safety, that prioritizes safety, this is something that really wouldn't work in the kind of society that we're in today, for example.
Yeah, it was, even in the world, it was an unusual situation. America had a uniquely free system. There were other examples of free banking in this period of history, but America had a pretty darn free system. It was imperfect, but it was pretty good. No real guarantees, at least not from the center. So it was pretty good system. And look, you have to grant that whatever you can complain about the system, but it actually was a kind of handmaiden or shepherd of the greatest period of growth in industrial history, really. What happened to the American economic structures between 1860 and, say, 1910 was a marvel for all the world. It was during this period where we got the commercialization of steel. We created new cities with skyscrapers. We had sound recording and photography and flight and electricity, lighting up homes and cities, and communication, telephones. It was just the most marvelous period of invention and expansion of incomes, a democratization of prosperity that we saw in America, made America famous all over the world. I mean, in the second half of the 19th century, there was a growing sense in the entire planet Earth, that whatever America was doing, they were doing it the right way. So now we have to fast forward to the Fed, because that's where things really began to change.
And so, this is, now we're talking about 1913. And so what, just very briefly, why?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the Panic of 1907. But like in all politics, sometimes the crisis is exaggerated for a reason. But there was something like a frenzy after 1907. We can't stand this system anymore. Ups and downs and bank failures and panics and, oh, we don't know if the money is there. And they said, look, we should bring this spirit that's given us all these great inventions in the private sector to government itself. Let's put the experts to work on banking and money. And the experts did come together, famously at Jekyll Island, and put together this new institution. It's a funny institution with a funny name, because it's actually not a national bank. Yes, it is a national bank, but it was more than that. It became a kind of regulatory cartel owner of all banks in the country. So you could not be a bank unless you were a member of the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve was going to be responsible for all clearing systems. How we got paid, when you finally get the thing that you're going for, when the money arrives at the institution that it's intended for, that's called clearing, and that was going to be entirely charged by the Fed. That was entirely managed by the Fed. So what happened was, this is the way it's normally described. Congress decided, in its wisdom, to take its powers over monetary matters, Article 1, Section 8, and delegate those to this new institution called the Federal Reserve. Now, you should just reflect for just 2 seconds. You and I are both interested in words. The word Federal Reserve is by itself funny, because it doesn't say central bank. Americans hated the idea of a central bank, because that was more like Germany and Bismarck or whatever. They didn't want that. Central bank is not an American institution, so they called it something completely different. It's actually kind of genius. They called it first the word federal. Federal meaning decentralized, consistent with the 10th Amendment. We're these United States, where we don't have a central government. We have a federal system where we, and so to accomplish that federal piece, the new central bank had branches. There's a Minneapolis Fed, an Atlanta Fed, a Dallas Fed, Chicago Fed, San Francisco Fed. So there's many Federal Reserve banks around the country for no apparent reason, really, except to create the illusion of decentralization. Okay, so there was that. And even now they're gigantic, and they employ all these researchers, and they say interesting things. But there's no reason for all these feds around the country. The second part, this word reserve, is funny when you think about it, because it implies that they have something. They're in the possession. We have the reserves. Just in case we need them, we have the reserves. If there's a crisis, we're going to be there to help you. You can have confidence in the system because we have reserves. Whatever. In those days, it was gold. Yeah. You don't need to worry. Finally, we have a system that's stable and functioning and scientific. But what's interesting is that, of course, and anybody would have predicted this. I mean, Thomas Jefferson certainly would have, Thomas Paine, this whole generation would have predicted. If you get anything like a central bank, a national bank, a central bank, it will be abused. It'll be abused immediately. But no matter the intentions, whatever, it'll be abused. So what presented itself soon after the Fed was founded? The war in Europe, the Great War. It was a mess, a terrible mess. And Americans wanted nothing to do with it. But at some point, so what kept America out of wars for the most part was, well, we just didn't want to afford it. We didn't have the money, Solve your own problems. We're over here on the other side of the world. We can mind our own business over here. And we don't have the money. Well, now with the Fed, you have the money. You've got a printing press. You've got this weird power of this one institution to buy and hold government-created debt with money that didn't previously exist. A check. You know, a credit, the nation had a credit card with an infinite balance on it, you know, infinitely high limit.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong, right? I mean, that actually, you know, and again, I think the founders of the Fed didn't really imagine this. They thought, well, we're all, look at us, we're responsible guys. You know, we know what's what. We would never do something like that. Well, they lost control of it right away. And so the Fed was probably the reason why the U.S. entered the Great War. Lots of people argue for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. A lot of people want the Congress to cut spending and so on and so on. But until you unplug the Fed's capacity to just print money and cover up for all the profligacy of Congress, we're never going to get there. We need sound money, or we're never going to get anything remotely like a balanced budget. It's the Fed that makes it all possible. The Fed provides a moral hazard that results in ever bigger government, ever more debt, forever. I think it's time for some accountability, and it's time for some clarity about what this thing we call the Federal Reserve is, to whom it's accountable, and whether and to what extent the voters have any place or role in oversight and controlling it. If we don't, you know, we're going to continue to lose our economic freedom, our independence, our aspirations for an enterprising economy with frugal people who can save money and be rewarded for doing so. There has to be a change. We live in times of great nostalgia where people want to recapture what we've lost as a nation. Freedom, independence, frugality, prosperity, families that can live off one income, and so on. So none of this is going to be possible unless we can figure out a way to restrain the Federal Reserve. I think in a circuitous and sometimes fumbling way, President Trump gets that. Intuitively, he understands that. This institution must be held to account. It must be accountable to the people and to the people's representatives. And I think that's a good decision. I think it's a good step. Let's see how it turns out.
Well, Jeffrey Tucker, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Jeffrey Tucker and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.